Hey guys, I'm Marcus. Let's get started. We're here to talk about Apache Accumulo integrated with Apache Ranger, and we'll go over, what is ABAC, because that's a central piece of the Apache Ranger technology. We'll go over what is Ranger, how Accumulo security works for anyone that's not familiar, and then a overview and a demo of the actual integration between Ranger and Accumulo. And then we'll talk about some future work on that effort. So what is attribute-based access control? So attribute-based access control is also ABAC. It's a NIST standard. It came out a couple years ago. It's emerging in the government space. A lot of agencies already have it. A lot of agencies are working on adopting it. Back when I was at DOJ, we pushed through that effort to get that started. So what is it? So ABAC is significantly different from RBAC, significantly different from ACLs. It allows you to take the subject, that's the person or entity making a request for resources, the object, which is the resource itself, the attributes of that subject and object, as well as their environmental conditions are used to make a policy decision. So you can have much more flexible policies, much more flexible, more descriptive, resources and subjects, as well as taking advantage of dynamic conditions in the environment. So why do agencies go for it? Well, RBAC itself is legacy. It's brittle. It's expensive to maintain, and it doesn't lend itself well to sort of the more complicated legal environments that particularly the government as well as other industries, other more regulated industries are finding themselves in. So that's why a lot of agencies and organizations are moving to ABAC. A couple examples. So when we were at DOJ as govies, they had about a half a dozen systems that were all responsible for implementing the same legal requirements. The only technology they had was RBAC. Every system had its own implementation of those requirements. Whenever any of those requirements changed, that required the data to be re-ingested. Security had to review every single system. The implementations were different, so it was a separate approval process and validation for each system, whereas a ABAC-based approach would allow those attributes that feed into the policy to be singularly defined and singularly implemented across the infrastructure and the systems there. So that gets us to Ranger. So Ranger is a 100% open source project. It's Apache. It's based on technology that was created by a company here in, DC metro area over in Virginia called XA Secure. That company was acquired by Hortonworks in 2014. In 2014, Hortonworks open sourced all of XA Secure's technology, donated it to Apache as the Ranger project. So it's a distributed framework for implementing security across the Hadoop ecosystem. So more than just Hadoop. It's over 10 different components. At this point, we're working on an additional one with Accumulo. It provides centralized policy management, centralized audit, but distributed enforcement and decision across the environment. So you can have authorizations on not only services, but the data that those services provide, all managed through a single console. That's kind of how Ranger works. I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks. Hi, I'm John. So he went over the what and why. I'd like to go over the how a little bit. So Ranger syncs policies via plugins that exist within each service. So you see the list of services that he kind of alluded to that it already has plugins working for. Those plugins periodically request from the administrative server, what can I do? It syncs with policy, writes them to disks. when an auditable event occurs, it sends that to whatever the audit locations are configured. The two defaults right now are Solar and HDFS. There's a Kafka implementation class that exists in the code, but I've never seen anyone use it, and we don't advertise it at our company right now. Right now I know of HDFS and Solar. So as you can see, Accumulo is potentially a new one. We'll go into a little more detail about how those things work when I show you the demo. Okay, and how Accumulo security works, so the pluggable security model is basically what I'm referring to here. There are many other security features within Accumulo. I'm going to briefly touch on the pluggable security things. John Vines gave a good presentation on this in 2014. It's still on YouTube. I know because I've watched it recently. I would encourage you to watch that video or read the book that exists there as well. So the authentication bit, Josh went over Kerberos in the previous talk if you were able to attend. The plugin that I've implemented right now depends on Kerberos. It doesn't have to, but that's for my simple POC, and going forward for the moment, that's the way it functions. Permissions, control system, table, namespace access. So granting authorizations, which, again, for the POC, not implemented right now. It's those are all controlled via Ranger. So basically, whether somebody has the ability to read from a table, create a table, write to a table, that sort of thing. And authorizations are the security labels that are important for the ABAC stuff that Marcus mentioned. That pulls the policies from Ranger as well in this demo. So what I've done so far is, and I'll describe what these assignments are and how the policies are defined in Ranger, and you'll get to see the actual UI in a second. So for resources labeled as table, namespace, system, and authorizations, you get authorization and auditing via Ranger. System has a star on it because it's kind of noisy. There are a lot of checks in the security operations or security operation class that ask for system permissions like repeatedly. So maybe a table scan had like 5 different system level requests. So for the moment, that auditing is muted, and then authorizations. So I created a plugin. For my demo, I used some existing code from, I think, Randy Gelhausen that will spin up a cluster based on a blueprint. So it, after downloading all the packages, it spins up an HTTP cluster that has Kerberos configured, Ranger configured, and that's the repo link right there. So demo, I'd like to show some bits. So these are statically mapped for now. This can be done via LDAP. I didn't configure it for the purpose of this demo. Mostly I just wanted to be able to show that the groups would be resolved. So when you do an Hdfs groups on the users that I've created, Dr. Bob, Jane, Tom, you see the groups they're a member of. This is executing within the container. That is basically where all the services are running right now. I created a simple table with the concept of like a doctor's office with patient data. Dr. Bob has PII, PHI authorizations. He can read the table, write to the table. He has permissions based on the namespace. Jane is billing, can read masked information, and Tom is a receptionist, can read masked information as well. And I can show you the policy breakdown for that. So these are the policies that have been defined. It's a little difficult to see all on the same screen. So there are group assignments, user assignments for the different sections for authorization, namespace, table, etc. So since this is awkward to see, maybe you're going to have to just trust me on the allocations for these. When we go to the console, all right, so Dr. Bob scanning the patient table. So he can see just a couple entries. Has specified no authorizations. If we do PII, he gets to see the labels that have that. If we do PII and PHI, he gets to see the different labels. He doesn't have access to the masked. There's an exception So these events are audited in Ranger. Which, again, is somewhat awkward to see here. So this is backed by solar. There's an infrasolar instance that gets installed. And you can see the accesses for Dr. Bob and the results. So you can see he was granted read permission on the namespace for office.patient on that top entry. And the authorization that he was denied for was a list that included mass PI, PHI, and PII. You can see the previous entries where he was not denied access. And so it shows the list of authorizations and then the table that he was given, or the namespace that he was given access to. So those all show up in Ranger. That functions as one might expect. So as a different user, we have Tom. Tom is a receptionist. So if Tom attempts to scan with, oops, I can't actually see what I'm typing. So bad authorizations, couldn't scan with PI. So you see he was denied the scan for PII, and the permissions that were granted for reading were for table, because he was granted explicitly office.patient. Those get resolved in Zookeeper via identifiers, and so for Ranger it was a little weird because I had to look up the names, because that's how Ranger conceives of resources that you have access to. So, yeah. So in terms of that last user, that maybe isn't as pertinent to see. But so you see the auditing that has occurred. The policies, I can pull open one. A little hard to read. So this is a dropdown. So the resource is specified here. Table was what's in the dropdown. I don't know, is that visible? Yeah. And then they were granted access via group to the table. No policy conditions, which would be like IP filter or something like that. And Tom was granted read and write via his group. And Jane was granted only read. So let's see. Independent of that. Accumulo is configured as a super user. He has access to masks as well as, so he can read all the bits. So he was granted a global access to auths. That's the way it's currently implemented. It doesn't have to be the case that you would have a user that would have the ability to scan for everything. Some places would be very sad at that type of implementation, but it's configurable via Ranger. I mentioned that the policies get synced. So this is within the container. So this JSON defines the different policies. This is periodically updated from the Ranger admin. The Ranger admin can be HA'd, so it would point to whichever one it was configured for. The load balancing is not built into Ranger. It's active-active type situation, so you would have to implement your own load balancer, but it is feasible. So that was just a simple demo of how it's actually performing some authorizations and auditing those events. I'm going to go back to the slides real quick. Which probably not from first slide. All right, so right now I'm not doing anything with any sort of authorization permission type thing in the API for the pluggable authorization elements for permission handler and the authorization element. Those are feasible. Like Ranger has an API that makes it very simple to do so. I just, for the sake of getting something working, I did not implement that bit. The audit events, so because of where they execute in the T server, I think that would be really chatty in the event of a full table scan on a very large cluster right now. So I need to take a peek at that. Ranger 919 is my ticket that I put in about a year ago to actually do this, and I finally had time to take a peek at it and implement something that's actually doing something. Resource lookup, it was a little awkward to see because of the resolution. I apologize, but in that resource definition in the policies, it can populate suggestions based on as you start to type out the names of resources. So that's also doable. I just didn't implement it for the moment. And LDAP attribute sync. Right now, Ranger was just using the, as Josh mentioned, UGI, if you were there, user group information. It's using the one from the Hadoop configs. And so that's why the static overrides that I showed earlier just had static mappings. It could be the case, and probably is the case for many people, that they already have the attributes that they care about in an LDAP. Ranger only syncs user and group information, not any other attributes from LDAP. So that's probably something that would be pertinent to add for another implementation. I think that's about all that I have, because the demo console was pretty awkward to read. Does anyone have any questions? I guess that depends on what you mean by a plugin that would work with Ranger. So Ranger itself wants to be the enforcement and auditing element. Okay, Ranger has REST API available. That's actually what the plugins use to sync their policies. And so you can create users, delete users, manage users, groups, policies, service definitions. You actually submit via the REST API, the type, all that kind of stuff. So that's doable. The plugin itself that I wrote is just a jar that needs to be dropped in. Okay, so permission. So there are three plugins: the authentication handler, the permission handler, and the authorization handler. Just in terms of the Accumulo security implementation for that bit. So in the permission handler, there's a set of methods that you need to override. It's an interface. You just need to make sure you implement those bits on those. So permission is for table, namespace, and system. And authorizations is just a list of the auths that are available to the resource, whether it's group as was labeled there or a user. So if you grant namespace.read to a user, he can read the tables in the namespace. Same with table. Table, namespace, system, also authorization. So the authorizations were configured via, I would have shown the policies a little bit better, but the resolution was somewhat problematic. So so each of those policies refers to a resource, and the resources that are available right now based on my configuration are the system, table, namespace, and authorization. So authorization is treated as a resource. You configure a policy, you specify the resource that is an authorization. So for the PII example, I created an authorization resource called PII, and in the policy items at the bottom of the page, which again was hard to see, you can specify a list of users or groups that have access to that. Just that one. So if somebody attempts to scan with PII and they have it, it went through and it was an auditable event. If they did not, then it popped it up as inappropriate.
And so those actually correspond then to
The labels that were on the data itself, yeah. So Dr. Bob had PII, PHI, and nothing else. If he attempted to look for the mass data, then it told him no. Yeah, no problem. So this this is within a single container right now, just for the purposes of demo. Okay, here.
Yeah, so we have a couple customers that have very large Ranger implementations. They're up in the thousands of policies. So we haven't tested specifically this, but Ranger itself scales well into the thousands of policies. So in that policy definition screen that he showed, it's thousands upon thousands of those. So that's I don't know the actual number, but it's well above 5,000.
No, it's requested. So it syncs the policies locally. That JSON that I briefly showed you, I didn't go into that. Each implementation of the plugin that exists for Ranger, so on each T server, it requests the policies and syncs it locally to a JSON configuration that is the latest update for that. If it can't communicate, it will use the last sync policy right now. It caches it to disk locally.
So
the policies. Yeah, it sends that to, right now it sends that to Solar. Yes. No, 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 it's sent asynchronous. Okay. Thanks.